Alright, so this is the beginning where we're going to dive in, we're going to start setting up all the effects and doing everything. So, quick couple of things I just want to mention. This is the performance here. I actually imagine this being, the final output being 48 frames a second, so we'll watch that as 48 frames a second for a moment. Just go through this really quick. This is just the proxy plate. So that's typically something that you'll get from like the offline edit when you're still locking down the edit and spitting out frames. So by proxy, it means that it's not like the final resolution. This is all shot at 8K. You know, you can tell here by the shot code that this is shot on a red, and you know, there's the frame counts, other information. This is all just in the slate specifically for you to be able to go back and track down your initial edit, your initial frames, all the sources. So you have all the stuff tagged to your shot just purely for that. But this is typically something the 3D doesn't deal with, but you know, it's usually what tracking might do because they're very early into the pipeline. But effects, typically you'll get a work in progress conform or something to work from. So this here, by the way, I was mentioning we got tracking markers, stuff like that, which isn't a big deal. This is actually, there's a few different shots we're doing. Some we're moving cameras, so like freeform, like perspective shots. And whereas this is obviously a lock off, so you don't need tracking markers or anything like that. But yeah, so the other thing is this was shot at 50 frames a second. This was on the red Epic W with the helium sensor, and I think it was with the Skin OPLF. Yeah, it was. So yeah, all you really need to know though is that this was shot at 50 frames a second and tracked out at 24. So typically the output that I've always had in mind was always going to be probably 48 frames a second in terms of the timing of the shot. So just a heads up that the playback, this might get sped up when it goes through into the final edit or into comp. However, we'll be working at 24 frames a second, which just gives us a bit more frames to kind of work with and do our shots with. So that, just a heads up about that, is not something that's really going to affect us. Okay, so all that being said, what we want to do is I want to create an infection that starts out on his face and also on his hands. And I like the idea of having the hands and the face and you know, a lot of things going on here, because if you're just doing an effect over, let's say, his face, nothing else, it always is going to look like this effect is just sitting on his face. The more that you can have those layers of effects and interaction, all that kind of stuff, it's going to give it more realism because there's more to interact with. So I love the idea of having like the fingers covering up some of the infection, you know, as it kind of spreads over the face, even having it kind of around the fingers a little bit, that sort of thing. So I think that could be really cool. But initially, the idea is that we're starting in at a frame 120, so as the hands are coming up, you're going to see an area of the face kind of begin to get infected, and also probably up on the forehead here. I imagine there being probably like 3 areas that get infected, and as the hands come up, that's when I'd like to also have the hands start to show some infection as well. Okay, and on top of that, we're gonna have some like steam, some liquid kind of pouring out, like pus, kind of as if the face is kind of melting. There's gonna be a lot of different layers to it, but it's all gonna start with figuring out where you know, where it all plugs in. So initially, you know, there's a dozen ways that we could do this, but what I imagine is that we'll probably paint all the effects because it's probably the easiest way to go about doing this. That way we can get ultra specific with the type of work that we're doing, rather than just using gradients with noise or some crappy procedural maps. We're still going to be very procedural in what we're doing, but at the ground level, it's important to get very precise with what we're doing. And it's also really great if you're able to do that. Like, there's so many movies where I've had like the director sitting with me saying, hey, can I get a little bit of fire on this guy's face over here? Can we get a little bit of this over there? And literally being able to go into Photoshop or Mari and be able to hand paint it in real time and get that feedback with the director there. That's really cool to have that that level of interaction. And That's exactly what I want to do here. A couple of things I'll quickly mention. Typically something like this, I probably would texture it with Mari just because the tools are great and it's very interactive. However, as I've mentioned earlier in this video, I really want to use the minimal amount of tools necessary to get this done. So, we're going to use V-Ray and we're going to use Fume. Everything else is out of the box. So in this case, I'm going to use Photoshop, which will give us the same exact result. But typically in production, I probably would use Mari just because that way, I've just got a lot of really great feedback. I can do high-res painting on my models in real time, and just having that kind of back and forth is really handy. Other thing I just wanted to mention, which I think is a good metaphor for what we're doing here, and I don't want to talk on and on about the stuff, but I think it's important in the beginning. You might notice with this match move that there's certain areas like a bit of the neck and the shoulder, the sleeve, that aren't matching up. And the reason for that is because, as we discussed, the focus isn't on these areas, okay? So the focus is going to be on, parts of the face that we want to get infected. And then there's going to be some collisions and interaction, things like that, foreground elements. So the track of the hands, for the most part, it's not 100%, but for the most part is focused a lot more on the areas that are really going to interact with this section here. And I think this is important to understand that, just because you're trying to match move a character doesn't mean that you need to be focused on getting areas like this 100%, because the interaction is not going to be there. And at the end of the day, everything comes down to time, which really comes down to money. If you're working on a production and you get given a shot like this, and if you were to match move it and you're focusing on getting a wrinkle in the sleeve to 100% line up, knowing that there's no effect over there, all you're doing is you're wasting time and costing money. And those little things like that might end up being an extra day or two of work. Could end up being about $1,000 or a couple $1,000 to get those right, knowing that they're not going to at all affect the work that you're doing. So I use that as a metaphor because so many times in production I see effects TDs that I'm managing where they'll work on something very specific that when you look at it from the context of the shot, you're not even going to notice that. You've spent days working on something that is so minute or not even visible in the shot. The focus could be elsewhere, that you end up wasting a lot of time. I think that's really critical here to understand that, like, you might be really focused on getting the spread of the effect here over the decay to be perfect, and then you realize, oh wait, the hand's covering all that up. And that stuff I see all the time, and I really want to point this out, that like in production, you do what's necessary for the shot. You don't do what's necessary for you, thinking that like you're really anal about things and it's got to be all perfect, because at the end of the day, time is money, and you need to focus on where your time is going to be spent. So when it comes to the track, if that was an extra day or two to do the sleeve or something that's irrelevant, I'd rather spend that day or two trying to get the track perfect rather than trying to focus on areas that aren't noticeable at all. Okay, and that is what I'm getting at with effects, is that you want to look at the context of the shot and say, well, look, what is going to give me the best result in the allocated amount of time that I have. Okay, so here when I look at this stuff, I think about trying to skip ahead and trying to think of, well, if the hand's going to be infected, it's going to have steam and it's going to have liquids. How critical are some of the things in here? Like, I imagine we'll probably just decay the entire face when the hands come up, so that way we can start focusing more consistently on the hand at that point, and that could be the focal point, because you've complete control with your effects to say, are these background effects or are these going to steal the show and really grab everyone's attention? And you don't always want that to be the case, okay? And too many effects trying to steal the show ends up being just a big mess. So that's my quick rant at the very beginning of this, because we've got a lot to go through, and I'd rather really focus on teaching you what's important in production rather than trying to make this perfect, tidy lesson that feeds a bunch of BS that, about stuff that isn't really important. I'd rather talk about, like, look, I've been doing this for 20-something years, and I want to tell you what is going to be critical when you're working on shots. So, quickly, I'm going to create a bunch of groups. I'm going to do this ultra quick. I'm going to do 1 characters, 2 lights, 3 cameras, 4 effects. Okay, and basically with effects and with the characters, there's going to be a lot of junk that we're going to be dealing with, and it's just, you know, locators, manipulators, or additional objects, whatever it might be, controllers. So I want to have a space for those. So initially I'm going to say character underscore render, and then I'm going to go back and create another one, and this is going to be called character underscore controls. And that's going to be where all the junk, all the non-renderable necessary manipulators and other things that I need are going to go. So the same thing with effects. There's going to be effects render, which might be like your fume effects grid, stuff like that. And then there's going to be effects controls. And I might break that down further from there as we get deeper into this, but there's going to be a lot of objects, a lot of things that we're dealing with, so I think it's necessary to have all that. Now, I'm going to get my camera, I'm going to drop this into cameras, character, I'm going to drop into character render. I need those to be in the necessary groups, so that way as we go through this, you know, we can keep things tidy and clean. And trust me, the amount of stuff that we're going to be doing in this, it's going to get very messy very quickly, and that's why I think it's just important to try and keep this as clean as we can. And I'm not the cleanest person, I'll admit that. Like when I need to share things with other people, I'll tidy them up at that point, but you know, typically in production I'm not as anal about, you know, everything needs to be everywhere it needs to be. I keep it kind of, you know, if I know where everything is, then that's all I need it to be. So, all right, so with this, we have character render, there's that character guy, and this is going to be like a matte object. You know, we'll render him out as a holdout, essentially. But initially what I want to do here is I want to get the face, and I'm going to unwrap it, and I'm going to paint very specific maps on there, and it's because hand texturing this stuff, I can get very organic shapes for the decay that I'm not going to get through a procedural map. I'm still going to make it all procedural later, but I think it's really critical this lesson to get hands-on while we can, before we kind of automate everything. So I'm going to go back to just a frame where the face is completely visible, the hands aren't holding it back or anything. I'm going to go to character controls, I'm going to click on that little layer there, so that way it's active, and that means anything that gets created, it's going to go in there. So I'm going to right click, click clone, really important, make sure it's on copy, and then we'll call this character head, we'll call it face decay, call it face unwrap. Okay, I'm trying to think of a good name for it. Okay, it's still cloned in there, but I'm going to left click and drag into character controls. Let's just hide the whole character render, but we still have this guy here, the character face unwrap. Now what I'm going to do with this is I am simply going to go poly select face, and let's do the lasso here, and I'm just going to basically select everything, okay? Everything from the neck down. You know, it doesn't matter being precise about this, because at the end of the day, none of that's, you know, we know we're going to be working on the face only, so I think this is fine. Now, delete mesh, and it's going to delete everything below it. It's still all there if you want to turn these layers off, and that's what I love about Max's modify stack, is that you can turn these layers off at any given time. The thing is that as I scrub through this, it's kind of slow, and the reason for that is because it's literally working in a linear fashion. It is still calculating the initial character, and then it's deleting the head, and you know, continues on. So I'm going to click poly select for a start, just to deselect everything, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to point cache this head out separately, and that way I don't need to worry about deforming or reading the cache of the entire character anymore. It's just going to focus on the head. So hopefully that makes sense. I just want to keep it fast and interactive, so I just want to focus on the head here and nothing else. So to do that, I'm going to click point cache, new, I'm going to make a directory here and save it in there. Now I'm going to hit record, and that's going to record all the frames here. So just hit that really quick. It'll take less than a minute, but they'll cache the head out, and that way I'll just be dealing with the polygons here and nothing below the neck. And it just means I've got a neat, fast, interactive, and locked down head that I can initially work with for generating a lot of the stuff. Because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be hand painting all these organic shapes as the face decays, and triggering all the other effects. And we're going to get very specific with that. So now this is done. Technically, it's going to load this in the memory, and that means that it's not necessarily reading everything below it. However, what I will do is I'm going to go and right-click, choose Cut, and that's going to cut, just like copy-paste cut, the point cache modifier, right-click, collapse everything, right-click and paste that. And by doing that, it means that I have this ultra-fast head that I can scrub in real time, because now all it's doing is it's dealing with just the head and the point cache animation for it. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty straightforward, but it's just going to speed up what I'm doing and make life a lot easier. So other thing, I'm going to hide the camera because I don't need that camera sitting there. But now we got this head. What I want to do next is I want to unwrap this. Okay, I want to use this to the paint on it. So let's just look for a good frame that we can initially work with here. I think that kind of works, but it is at a weird angle. What I'll do is, let's click UV to put a UVW map on there. Cylindrical. Let's go view align. This is a bit of an odd angle, so I went to the front view, clicked view align. I'm going to hit rotate. Let's make it local. So it's just using the local coordinates. Now, a couple of things I want to do. One is I want to align it. You can kind of see there's like a little line. I want to make sure that that's on the top, because that means that it's the top of the unwrap. And I'll try clicking fit now. So all I'm doing is I'm just trying to align it better to there. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, another 45. Okay, so I'm going through this kind of quick, but all I'm doing is I'm rotating the cylinder to start unwrapping more at the back of the head. Okay, so there's another modifier called unwrap UVW. I'm going to click that for a moment. I just want to look at it in the UVW editor, and we can kind of see what we got here. So it's not perfect, but it'll do for what we need it to do. Okay, and that is that by doing this cylindrical and doing it from the back, we get all the front unwrapping perfectly. Now, one other thing that we can do is click on pelt mapping down here, a quick peel, and that's just going to do a perfect unwrap. It's going to flatten it out a lot more. All right, so I think it was like Max 5 that got pelt mapping, or Max 6. I think it's Max 6, but yeah, it's it does the trick. It just kind of, it's like a cloth simulation. We'll just kind of let it all relax until it's kind of more uniformly spread out, and you can continue to do that more if you needed to. Yeah, so quick relax till flat, I think. Yeah, so I don't really personally do much unwrapping. It's not something that, like match moving, camera tracking, and yeah, UV unwrapping, those are typically tasks that I don't need to worry about. I'm always going to have other people for that, but it's still good to know all three of those, at least camera tracking and unwrapping to a degree. Okay, so all we did is we quickly unwrapped it, and now what I want to do is I'm just going to open up the UVW editor, and we got the face here. So like I said, all I want is to be able to paint specifically where I need to on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Tools, Render UVW Template, And I'm just going to make this a little bit higher. There's actually a lot of wasted room, so if we wanted, we could scale this up. I'm happy with this kind of being uniform in terms of its scale, so I'm not going to worry about that. But I will go to mode and go normal. Okay, so we're doing 2K map, and we're outputting the normals. And let's click render. And what that's going to do is it's going to spit out a map that looks like this. Okay, and I'm using the normals just because it gives me something to look at, just so I can get a better idea of, you know, I can see the elevations or the curvature where there is some things like that. So it just helps me get a better idea of like where there is a lot of curvature or angles on the geo. So I'm going to save this map out, and you can just make this a JPEG. I'm just going to call this car face UVW V001, and we'll just make it a JPEG, spit that out, and then load that into Photoshop. Okay, so first things first, just double click on the layer to make it an actual layer, and let's zoom in a little bit. So the cool thing is that now we have got this set up, we can paint on here, and we can actually get this all layered onto the character. So as a separate layer, so Control-Shift-N, I'm not going to give any Photoshop advice. There's probably more Photoshop tutorials than there is anything else on the planet out there, so I'm sure there's something good out there. So point being that, let's just say that we wanted to decay this part of the face, and we also want to decay down here and here. I'm going to save this now as a PSD file. Okay? And let's just go into the material editor. I'm currently using the material editor classic. I like working procedurally for everything, including shaders, but for the sake of this lesson, I think that it's going to be a lot more straightforward, less confusing to communicate it through the classic material editor. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to load in that bitmap. So you got the PSD. I'm going to load in the PSD, and it's going to say, do you want to collapse all down? Yes. And let's just drag this onto the face and click show in viewport. Now, because this is unwrapped and we painted exactly onto here, the map's going to show up exactly like that as well. So this is handy to keep in mind, because it just means that you know, we're able to freely paint on this now and get exactly the sorts of effects we want. So rather than just using the brushes that come with Photoshop, I'd rather go and try and find some images that kind of work closely enough for what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay, and I'll save the trouble of having to go in there. I'm just going to load up some images that I already looked for and I thought, hey, this looks okay, and they were pretty easy. I think I just looked for like splatter, decal, or something like that. So these are just 4 random maps that I downloaded off the web, and any of these, you'll notice there's transparency. There are PNGs for some of them. I'm just going to bring them in, paste them. And you'll notice that they're all different, and that's the big thing here, is that we got to decide like how we actually want to use these, because they're all quite different in terms of how they work. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw them together really quick, hack together what I want, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I don't want this to be a Photoshop course, so I'm just going to quickly mock up what I want for this. So initially I'm going to hit Control-Shift-N, and I'm going to make this gray, and I'm going to hit Shift F5, make it gray. I'm going to do it again, black. And it's because eventually I'm going to be having a black background for everything. And for the time being, I just want a gray washed out background to work on. And initially what I might do is just get one of these. I'm going to just move it over, put it on the right cheek somewhere. I don't want this to be too big, So I'd rather just get something like that, maybe even. It kind of is funny that this is completely on an angle. I should have rotated it, but anyway. Next one, oops. Again, you'll notice I'm not actually naming this stuff. And for this, I might just switch this to darken for the time being. And the whole point is I just want to make this an area that, you know, I'm just going to get some kind of interesting pattern from. And I might duplicate this again. So try and keep this fairly small. And also, I'm going to push it back a little bit so it's not near the brown line, because I do know the brown line is going to be animated quite a lot, and I want this to be a bit more locked without deforming too much, because I just think that, yeah, it's going to look a bit weird otherwise. So this here is more of a crack texture, but I think this could be really cool for veins, stuff like that. So I think that I'll end up using that quite a lot. So again, just moving this down. And just want to orientate this a little bit, maybe squeeze it in. Yeah, I really wish I had rotated this. If I wanted to rotate this, I would just do it in the UV unwrap and then spit it out again. But anyway, point is that I've got that on this side. I think that's fine. And then we have the cracks here. And just to make this simpler, I'm just going to invert that and then screen it. And you can see that the black's on 100% black, so just pulling that in a little bit. Okay, so let's just turn all this on and we'll start to work through this really quick. Just for the sake of consistency, I might just do the same for these as well. So all I'm doing is I'm just gonna invert it, same with this guy, invert it, and then screen these on. Because eventually I'm going to make them all white, so I might as well just do it now. And it looks like the same deal. Levels. Alright, cool. So eventually they're all going to get white, but just initially looking at this stuff, I'm just going to start to manipulate a few of these things, duplicate them, do whatever I want to them, but the whole point is just to kind of make this a bit more interesting. And is this more because that way you're getting something that just doesn't look procedural, because that's the thing, is you just don't want this to look like any other turbulent noise pattern. So it's just about getting something a little bit more interesting out of this, because basically all the decay is going to start to spread through these cracks, which I think will look really cool. And then we have all that stuff up here. Yeah, I'm just going to get this stuff and group it. The main thing is I just want to shift it. The only thing I don't want is this to look like it's centered on the head. So I might just move it over here. Okay. And yeah, and so we got some on the cheek. I'm just gonna get one of these crack ones here, duplicate this, and just get something going along there. And from here I'm just going to start to paint the stuff up as well. So we'll just paint some layers that go in between it all. I'm just doing whatever I can to make it not too, actually this will do, too centered on the splatters there. But I think that'll work. Screw it. Yeah, anyway, I could do this forever. In fact, cool. Okay, so next up I'm just going to quickly paint in some layers as well. So, you know, use whatever brush. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We're to get something splattery. I kind of like what we already have. This is more about if I want to, you know, continue the shape a little bit more beyond what we currently have. I might personally go through and make something that's a bit more my style. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to kind of give that demonstration. So let's just assume that this is what we're going for. You get the idea. So the main thing is this is all going to be black and white. And I do want this kind of feel like as if it's essentially it's going to grow around the face, and that's why I kind of want to have those areas. I'm not trying to make this look special. I've personally already made a few maps that I like on earlier tests, just when I'm kind of, you know, concepting this. Those ones have worked really well. But yeah, ideally something along the lines of this. Now the big thing is that I want to flatten these layers down, and this is going to be essentially all the main infection. Okay, so we just need to do something that we feel is going to kind of grow out of the effect. Alright, anyway, so we get the idea. From here, let's get all of these layers and I'm just going to turn all the bottom ones off just so we have these that are visible. I'm just going to say merge visible, and that way we get it all as one layer. Finally, I'm going to go into saturate it, and that way we get something black and white. I'm going to go into curves, and let's just push up some of the grays because I want this to, you know, be a lot more brighter overall. So I think that works pretty well. Actually, I'll more just push up the grays, and we'll keep this pretty neutral. Okay. Cool. So that's good as a starting point. Now going back to the face, if we were to have this on, let's just screen it for now so we just see it as it is. But if we're to look at this, it's cool. We got like this decay happening here. And what I want to do next is I want to treat this as more the actual area that's the texture. So going back to the face, if we were to look at this, it'd be more the actual face being decayed, but then below that I want to have another layer, and that other layer is going to be the actual flesh being eaten up. And then from there I'm going to have one more layer, which is going to essentially be holes. So I'm actually make this all a little bit bigger. So essentially holes that are going to emit fluid. So we're going to have three layers in here. One's going to be the actual texture, and one's going to be more the areas that are peeling away, revealing you know, what's underneath. And then after that, there's going to be you know, liquid emissions. Okay, so I apologize for this. I'm going to push this up one more time because just thinking of that in that context, I just want to make these be a little bit more solid in the center. And so this is the outer layer. And so let's just call this texture mask. And then I'm going to create a new layer. And this new one we'll just paint. But let's make it green, just so that way it's a little bit easier to identify. And I want to more paint something here that's going to be a layer inside of all of this. So picture as this kind of like decay happens on the face, it's actually peeling away all the flesh, as interesting as that sounds, but it's peeling away all the flesh. And so what you end up having is all the inside is more, displacing down, like tearing apart the skin. So we don't need to go crazy in this. The main thing is going to be to just give it some edges, things like that. So this typically I would make it a little bit more opaque. I don't want to have like transparent edges because I really want there to be like a hard displacement down, because we're going to use displacement for this. So just getting that, and then getting some little cracks. Okay, like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to get something going for that. Same deal up here. Now, like I said, I probably will spend a bit more time on this, ideally just, if anything, I just want to make the shapes that I currently have just a little bit bigger. Because you want the infection to spread more than what we currently have. And I definitely want this to be, more focused on effects, but I think it's important too to realize, like, just because you're an effects TD doesn't mean that you're not going to utilize every other part of 3D and 2D, and that's, I think, another big thing that a lot of people are just going to get really into trying to do procedural stuff, thinking that, like, that's going to make them awesome. And, you're limiting yourself by not exploring all the other areas of 3D. They're there for a reason. It doesn't mean that only a lighter should touch lights. You should be learning all of this stuff inside out. Okay, so I might use the eraser tool. Just so we can kind of reverse that a little bit. All right, cool. So that'll do. And so what this layer is going to be, like I said, it's going to be the holes in the face. But from there, I want to go a step further, and we want to actually create some pockets of where we want to emit liquid from. So as weird as it sounds, I'm going to make this blue. I've created a new layer. And again, this isn't going to show up. Sorry, I should be using a paintbrush. This isn't going to show up as a texture or anything. It's purely going to be some information we can use to emit the stuff. So it's more about creating some, just pockets inside of there at the very center. Okay, so again, going back to the green, actually going back to the white here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this red, okay? So the reason for that is that I want to use all of these textures together additively, so that way we've got 3 different maps in one that we can use in 3D. So this is something that we did on Daybreakers, the movie. We were doing all the animation and the rendering in Houdini, and we're doing all the effects in Max. And so what we're doing is we're outputting all the texture maps from Houdini for different layers like fuel and smoke and burn maps and things like that, all as one map that would have like RGB and alpha information. So 4 different channels in there, and that's something that's really powerful to have it all in one map that you could generate and put out. So in this case, I'm going to go into curves, I think, yeah, and then I'll go green. So this went into image adjust curves, and I click the green channel and bring that down to 0. The blue channel, bring that down to 0, and that's going to leave us with just a red map. And I'm going to make that normal for the time being. And then, so we got red, and then we got the green, and then we got the blue on top. So that's looks kind of like a DEM file, like hide information or something, but well, not hide, but yeah, you get what I'm saying. So yeah, so basically this is just something that we can start with. I want to get the texture mask. I have one last crack at this, and I'm just going to solidify some of this so it doesn't, just so it's a little, it fills out a little bit more around this, just because, like I said, this is going to be more the outer spread area. So just in some specific areas, I'm going to do one last take of getting these areas. You could have this on if you wanted to. I don't really, care too much at this point. I know how this is looking, and I mainly just want to fill that out. And more importantly, I'm going to get this whole area. And I'm a big fan of curves. So I'm just flattening a lot of this down. And it might be more that, I push some of these areas up a little bit more. So I think these aren't bad. I might just roughen up the edges just a little bit. All right, cool. So this will do. Next step, now we've done this, and I just want to make sure there's no holes. That's one thing that is pretty important. All right, so next step that we want to do here, and let's fill this out, is we're going to start to output this information. Sorry, one last thing. I'm going to pull that back a little. Okay. Cool. So we've got all these now. What I'm going to do, keeping it on black, I'm going to make these all add to each other. So what that means is we have a map here that has all this information, and it's not just red, not just green, not just blue, but they all add to each other, so they got a lot of color information. So I'm going to save this as my PSD, as I've been doing. Go back in here, and now we can see that we have this map assigned. Automatically it'll update, it'll detect that it needs to update. And the cool thing is that I can go in here now, and I have all this information displayed on the character. Okay? So going back in, we have this map, it's the PSD. I'm going to click, and we'll do a color correct. And the cool thing about this is if I show the map, now what I could do is I could, if I wanted to, just display one channel. So we have the red channel, the green channel, or the blue channel. So I've got all of these layered into one mask. So I can use one to control the spread, and then one could control the displacement, and another controls the holes that we could emit liquid from. And again, if I need to, I can go back in and adjust the layers. If I needed to make the holes bigger or anything like that, it's very straightforward for me to do that. Okay. So you know, that was the less fun part of this, but it was a critical part. Now that we have that, I'm going to go in and let's start to set this up. So what I want to do now is start to set up a particle system to animate over this, because what I want to have is, we have the decay and all this on the face. I want to now be able to control where it reveals. Okay? So what we'll do next is going into effects controls, make sure this one's highlighted. We'll make this the top viewport, and I'm just going to choose particle system and PF source, drag that into the viewport. Now that's just in the create panel, particle systems. Now the modify panel, click particle view. In the future I'm just going to hit 6, which is the hotkey to open this up, but this is your default particle system. So I'm going to right click and delete that, and let's just start with our system. Okay, so having this clicked, the default viewport count that displays is 50%. So I'm going to set that to 100%, and the particle limit to an infinite amount. Now that's just that way it doesn't cap out. It's going to show all the particles in the viewport. And the next thing I want to do is I'm going to say birth texture, and then link these up. Now what that will do is allow me to emit from the texture. I'm going to set this to start at frame 120 because that's when we start. Click initialize parameters. It's going to display all the options on the right. And yeah, basically I'm going to add this object. And yeah, having that added in, we've actually got controls in here if we wanted to use red, green, or blue. Let's go back to that texture though. I'm just going to make sure this is all set up as it was, so red, green, and blue, and alpha. Now the reason for that, or if I wanted to, I could just make it monochromatic. The reason for this is that I just want to use the entire black and white map. Another thing that I can do is I can go up one level and say self-illumination 100%. This is purely just for me to be able to see it without any lighting in the shot, but these are all the maps being displayed. Those 3 stars at the back look a bit weird. So this is going to help me because now I can emit from a black and white map. So clicking initialize again. In here I can set this to be 120, 120. So it's just going to emit for one frame a bunch of particles from this black and white map. And we've got this value called whiteness. We can set that to 75%, and it means that the color tolerance is going to be a lot more lenient. It's going to respect a lot more of those grays rather than just the peak white colors, like the last 10% or 1%, sorry. So this is something that like came from particle flow tools back in the day that I had a lot of time like really kind of helping develop, just in terms of a lot of the features I love from Maya back in the Maya days. I wanted to really kind of push over. So Oleg, who invented particle flow, we put a lot of these tools in, and this is something that birth texture gets overlooked a lot. People kind of forget that it's even there, but it can be really powerful because it bakes out the textures once into memory, and it doesn't need to recalculate ever again. It bakes it to disk inside the file as well. So it's kind of cool, rather than needing to recalculate every single time, it just does it once. So what we want to do is just at frame 120, we're going to emit a certain amount of particles. We'll just initialize it, and you can see here we get some particles get emitted, which is cool and everything. It's definitely not enough, but we'll cover that in a moment. The main thing I'm looking at is the whiteness. Okay, and one thing I can do is, instead of just playing with the whiteness here, we can actually do it inside of the shader. Okay, so in other words, I could get my brightness, I could push that up, I could get my contrast, push that up, and it just means that we have some brighter values to play with. I can run that again, and that definitely kind of helped get, you know, a lot more going on. So this is working out pretty well, and from this point, what we'll do is I'll bring up the whiteness value a little bit to 81, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this to separate, and I might need to just refresh that for that to show up, but separate, what that will do is instead of just distributing particles and trying to throw them everywhere, because you'll see here it's not that even, it's kind of everywhere, and it means that there will be a lot of duplicate particles kind of clustering together. Separate treats it like a 2D map, and it'll actually run through the UV, so actually will essentially evenly distribute the particles next to each other. It takes a little bit longer because it's kind of like a 2D version of a level set. So in other words, it's evenly distributing these particles even distance from each other. So you can click on the fast approximation, and that can speed things up a little bit. Let's just try 0.5. I think we need to go a bit more than that, but you'll notice that this actually didn't take that long, but we'll lower the value a little bit more. But yeah, it does take a little bit longer to do, but you can see that the distribution is a lot more even. So let's try 0.08. Now we can see it's taking a little bit longer to do, but we definitely want to have a lot of particles, and the finer it is, the more it's going to really respect that shape. And you can start to see that there, that we can see it's starting to go inside the cracks, it's starting to go everywhere. So that's kind of cool. That's kind of what we're after. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit more, like let's try 0.05, and what that means is it's going to hopefully respect those cracks a little bit more. I will bring this down to 75 again and run it, but I'm hoping that we can kind of start to see a lot more particles being distributed inside those cracks there as well. Now the reason I'm using a particle system is because it's something that will allow us to procedurally animate this and have a lot of control. But what we're really doing is we're going to, you know, hand paint where we want all these different layers of liquid, of fume, of texture, of displacement, of blending, all this stuff together. But then, sorry, let me center this really quick. But then, you know, once we've generated all of this, we'll be able to use particles to actually activate where things happen. And I like using particles a lot of the time because it allows me to add a lot more chaos into things. And that's why even with fume, you'll probably notice that I'll use particles to trigger a lot of stuff a lot of the time, just because it allows me to quickly be able to randomize things and, you know, add a lot more factors into things that typically if you're doing it all by hand, you don't have as much control. Okay, so now that's looking good. I'm going to click display and change my display to dots, and it's just a little bit finer. We obviously have a lot of particles that are here. It's kind of insane. I probably, you know, I'm not going to use nearly that much of these, but I'd still rather have all the information initially to work with. Now the other big problem is that, you know, right now I just baked it out for one frame, which is a bit of a problem because the head still moves around. Okay, but that's not too big a deal. We'll tackle that next. But the main thing is that we've got this all set up. We've got a hand-painted texture map that's now creating particles, and the next step of this is that I want to basically set up a system where over, you know, a certain amount of time, we'll have areas start to activate, little areas start to pop open as it goes. So what we'll do, I want to get this whole set up. Let's rename this and call this PFS for Particle Flow System, and we'll call this Placement Shapes. Okay. Now I'm going to hold Shift and duplicate this event. And one thing I haven't done, actually, yeah, we are in effects controls. It's good. So you'll notice that all of the events and everything are being displayed in here as we create them. So I'm going to create a new event. I'm going to do the same thing, make sure it's 100% and all that, and we'll rename this and call this PFS Activation Shapes. Alright, so now we have two different systems doing the exact same thing, but the cool thing is it doesn't calculate anything, it's just reading in those 31,000 particles in each system. So, with the activation shapes, let's start with this one first. Now, what would be cool here is if we get rid of a lot of the particles. Like I said, I'm not really going to use that many, but it's good to have them there. So I'm going to say split amount, and let's just get rid of half of these off the bat. So it's going to have a delete node here. Let's just split most of these, and I'm going to set the percentage to, I don't know, something higher, like 99.5. You know, so we end up with just a few. Now, with the remainder, let's send them on to a new event, and the new event, let's have a shape, and we'll just make this a sphere, and we'll display as geometry. Okay, so I went through it kind of quick, but you saw my steps. All I'm doing, and by the way, pflow always does this. If it isn't updating right away, I just might need to like turn it all off and then on to see the update. So just FYI. But yeah, basically it's just still generating all these shapes. Now I'm going to set the size of this like 0.5. Again, I might need to refresh. Just going to disconnect that for a moment, just while I'm refreshing, so I can use the hotkey. But anyway, so at least now we can see all the points. There's still way too many, so I'm going to set this to 99.9%. And all it's doing is it's allowing me to see that, you know, we've got a few different areas that we got all these points generating. I'm going to make this red just so it's really easy to spot. And I'm also going to say split amount, 99.95%. I really just want a few particles. And let's just click new a few times. And I'm just looking at the distribution here. So you can see it's changing each time. So I can kind of choose like where do I want a focus of these to be. Now what this is it's basically going to be a bunch of spheres that are going to have like grow over time and activate that area. Okay, so initially you know, that placement seems fine. So it's going to get rid of most of the particles to start with, and from there what I'm going to do is I'm going to have these scale up over time. Okay, and I also want to control the timing as well. So I think that's really critical, is to be able to have a lot of control over how this works. So what we could initially do is have, instead of a send out, we could actually say age test, and we can set that age test to absolute and set it to, let's say, 135 and vary by 20, and it just means that now at frame 120 there's not much on there, but you see these little particles start to pop on over time. And the other thing we can do is we could lock the remaining particles to the shape. So click, I just did a right click, test, lock bond, and again that just came from, what was it, with Maya. You have like the UV goal weights, and I really love that about Maya, was just the fact that you could lock particles really easily to a surface, and that sort of thing, yeah, is just really critical for what we need to do. So like with this, it shows lock to surface. It's an animated shape because it's deforming, and snap to surface. So that way these particles are literally snapped and locked on the surface here. And I'm just going to right click, copy, and then paste instance. And it just means that now, it might be a little bit slower, but you'll see that these particles, no matter where the head moves, these particles are appearing on there. Now the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to go and choose scale, and we could either hand animate this, or we could just say relative successive and do like 108, something like that. What happens is it'll incrementally just grow over time. So we got that option if we just wanted to do that. And, you know, that's just essentially us trying to visualize the spread over the face. So that might be a little bit too much. Try 105. And it just means that now these spheres over time are growing bigger, bigger, bigger. The higher the value, the faster they'll do it. Okay? But it just means that these now kind of scale and scale up until they're ridiculously big. So we can try that for now. What I want to do at this point is move away from this setup for a moment and let's go back to what we had. I was going to relink that back up. Hopefully yours isn't doing what mine's doing. It's just, you know, the how I got to turn it off then on to activate. So another thing I can do is just paste that lock bond in here as well. And it means that suddenly all of these particles are now locked to the face. So let's just take a look at what we've got so far. So obviously the red spheres look really weird, but as you can imagine, what we're probably going to do next is, or what we are going to do next is we're going to use those shapes to activate the other particle system and have that create shapes and do its thing. And bit by bit, we're essentially building up a system which is going to drive into a shader and allow us to create our blend map. And that'll be fully procedural. And it might be slower now, but we'll cache it to disk and it'll all go back to being real time. But the cool thing is that this allows us to have that complete freedom. Now, I do think that the, first of all, the scaling up is not ideal, but I want to kind of do this in baby steps. You know, the scaling up's a bit weird because it exponentially grows faster and faster. The other thing is that the actual shapes, you know, I think eventually will be not very organic. Like the spheres will look a little too uniform. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a sphere. Let's call this shape noise. And I'm just going to add a noise modifier, make a fractal. Scale it down. And I really don't care too much about the shape, okay? Like, if it looks like that, it's not the end of the world. It's more about, I might change the seed though, but it's more about just getting something that's irregular. So, I mean, that looks crazy, but even going back to sphere, show end result, make sure that's clicked on, I can lower the segments down, and I mean, it's more about just getting something pretty basic that I can work with. Okay, now going into particle flow, let's turn all this off for a moment. I'm going to instance that sphere. So I'm just going to drag this guy on top of the old one to get rid of it, and click this guy. Now he's added in. I'm going to hide that sphere because we don't need to see it anymore. We have that as an instance, okay? So we've just instanced that shape. I can turn this back on, and yeah, this is getting even more ridiculous. So now we've got these weird shapes appearing. With the scale, one thing I might do is go back into relative successive, and let's just change this back to 100 and change this to absolute. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to actually animate this to scale up over time. So let's look at what 100 looks like on here. Okay, so that's what 100 currently looks like. Let's make it 150 or 200. Like I said, I don't know why I've got to refresh mine. So 200 is pretty crazy. But I'm going to hit auto key. Let's set this to like 205, whatever, just some value that sets a keyframe. Now, what I want to do is by setting a keyframe of at 120 of 205, it means it also set a keyframe at frame 0. So I'm just going into my curve editor, which is like editors, curve editor, and just right click show like animated tracks if you need to, but I'm just going down to event 04. We have that scale. So let's just click these two buttons here, or else I'll zoom out. But basically I just want to get the curve here, and I'm able to then be able to hand animate the curve growing over time. Okay, so one thing I just want to point out, like right now these are locked. These are a few little technical details that are important. They won't look like they're important, and I don't want to over confuse everything, but all we're doing is we're going to be scaling this operator up over time. So I set a keyframe just so that way I had something to work with here. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to click constrain proportions here off, so that way these aren't linked anymore. I'm going to get the X one, and I'm just going to click right click copy, go to Y, paste as an instance, and then again as an instance for Z. So all I'm doing is I noticed at least like 10 years ago, I haven't really checked since, but basically if these were all linked, they sometimes offset a little bit, so I just want to unlink the constrained proportions and paste them like that, so that way they all are linked. Now in the Y, I'm just going to right click and make the curve just a Bezier curve, and right click on this guy and make that a Bezier curve, so that way we just get more of a linear flat curve. Okay, so you might need to select both and then click these two, but basically that's our curve right now, and that's doing that over 120 frames, which is pretty slow. So Max's interface is always changing, or the buttons are, I should say. But yeah, I just clicked add key, and let's just move this guy up a little bit, so that way we get a nice kind of bell curve shape. And now the important thing is that now that we've animated this over from frame 0 to frame 120, which is what animation starts on, it's still going from 0 to 120. It's going to scale up to that size. What I can do is under animation offset keying, I can change this to event duration, and it means that when a particle comes in here, it's going to read in that value, which at the beginning was, that's a good point, what the heck was it? So event 4, okay, so we can make the start out at, let's say 50. So I'm going to do this again. I apologize for this. Getting ahead of myself. So I'm just going to fit this. So right now it's starting at 50. It's going to 205. And I might, instead of adding adding an extra keyframe, I'm just going to instead make these tangents. So that way we get that bell curve without needing that second keyframe. But basically at frame 0, it'll be at a radius of 50, and then when it comes in here, but it's offset by the event duration, it's going to scale up over 120 frames to 205. So let's see if that's enough for speed and everything else. Alright, so that's happening pretty fast, but I think that works pretty well. So now we get this kind of expansion over time. I know that this looks weird as hell, but the thing is we're not going to look at this. This is purely there for activation. So I just put a rotation on here too, so that way we just get everything to kind of rotate. The one thing I might need to do is go back to lock bond and set the rotation lock to 0, and that way it's not going to affect the orientation. But now we just get these weird shapes that are kind of expanding over time. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. It just, all we're doing is we're using those shapes to activate everything, and they look weird as hell, but the point is that this way they're not a perfect sphere. It's going to be more chaos, and obviously we don't need to look at it. The next thing that I want to do is under effects, I'm going to create a new layer, make sure nothing's selected, new layer, and I'll call this Meshers. And I'm going to put a few things in here over time. What I will do for now is I'm going to go to Create Panel, Compound Object, Mesher, and drag that into the viewport. Now what Mesher does is it'll take anything inside of Max and turn it into a mesh. So you could get like the camera icon and make it, turn into polygons. So it's just a good way to be able to get anything that might not be considered or recognized as a certain class and make it into a polygon. and it'll update in real time unless you tell it not to. So the cool thing is, with this, I have my activation shapes. I'm going to click on Pick Object, and under Effects Controls we have the PFS activation shapes. So I'm going to click there, and it's going to add that in there. Now, right now by default it says use all pflow events. Turn that off, and instead we specifically just want to say event 004, and we'll call this I don't know, activated shapes. Okay, so click add, and then we can see all the events, and I might have clicked the wrong one, but I'll do select by name, it might be easier. So PFS, and then activation shapes. That should work. Add, and then we can say activated shapes. So what it's doing is it's actually creating this mesher. You can see it here. It's creating this based on the shapes being created here. So as they grow, it grows as well. So finally, just down here you've got the XYZ, it's got the positions. I'm just going to zero these out. We're just centering this back to 0, because you can offset this. You can move it around, do whatever you want with it. So I'm going to right click my move button and center those back, and that way they're sitting exactly where the other shape is. Okay. The cool thing is that this is actually a mesh. I could add a volume select, I could do whatever I wanted to it. Okay, and so as this is expanding, what I can next do is I can go into our original system here, and let's just start working on this now. And I know that, you know, this is a pretty robust, like pretty simple setup so far, but it's still a lot of steps we've had to go through. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a group selection, and I'm basically going to say I want to use a certain amount of particles, like I want to be able to split them off based on if they're inside the volume of that mesher. So I can say split group, and I'm not going to use all these particles, but I'll demonstrate it for now. I'm going to get that lock bond, right click, copy, paste, paste instance, and we'll split the group into there. Okay, and I'll change that to dots so we can see there's dots. Now with the group selection, I'm going to choose to see inside of an object. I'm going to click the object, and we have the mesher. So already, the thing about pflow is it's going to add events wherever it's active, and before Max 2018 these were always invisible. So we'll fix this up in a moment. The point is that I just want to choose the mesher 001, and right now it's complaining that it can't deal with that because there's a circular reference, and the reason for that is because I think of this birth texture. It's basically saying this birth texture here is either the birth texture or the lock bond. It's just not digging the fact that these are referencing each other. Okay, and one thing we're going to do here, I know this is going to sound weird, but slight mistake here, and this is going to be an invisible thing that's going to pop up because we kind of created this all at the same time, and we did instance some stuff, even though technically if I were to right click, make these unique, and set this all up, it's still not going to like my mesher. This is really frustrating, so let me point this out. So if I go into effects, meshers, and add the mesher, it's going to complain that there's a circular reference. In other words, basically the mesher is reading something that is from this particle system, that's from this system, or something like that, and therefore it's creating a circular reference. Like it's got a feedback loop basically that it doesn't like, and it really isn't true. There's nothing in here that is doing that. However, it's telling me that there is. Okay, so I'm calling BS on that, but because of that, the easiest thing to do to break away from that is probably just to disconnect everything and get the birth, link that up, then do the group selection, inside object, and click the mesher. And now it's accepting it. I'm going to do a new lock bond from scratch. Click the geo, lock, animate, snap. Keep that on 0. So we've got that set up again. We just had to disregard some of the stuff, and it's stupid, but it's giving us that feedback because technically we're copying and pasting these operators around, and for whatever reason there's something under the hood that still has a connection between the two. So technically I try not to copy paste too much just in case something like that pops up. But anyway, so I'm going to do a group, a split group, and then I can still copy paste within here. So paste instance, that's fine. It's just, that's fine. It's just we don't want these two systems to talk more than they need to. So with this group selection, I'm going to put it below everything. I'm going to make it continuous, and I'm going to make it an animated shape because this shape technically is deforming. So I'm going to make it an animated shape, and with that mesher, what's going to happen is now these particles, we'll make them change to green, something really obvious. We'll make it blue. As this begins to spread, and one last thing, I'm just going to right click on the play button, make sure real time is turned off, so that way it plays every single frame, and it might play slower, but it's going to go through properly. So, this is definitely slower now, but what's happening is this particle system here, as it expands, it's activating particles in this group and telling them to go to that group. Now, I will say, within like Thinking Particles or Houdini, there's a few other systems around. It's much easier to do everything we're doing, but we are doing this all out of the box with particle flow, which is a little bit more limited, but we can still do all that stuff. So that's why we just got to be a bit more careful. But as you can see, as this expands, it's beginning to activate everything. And a couple of things I'll quickly do. Right now, obviously, we've got like all these events appearing in the wrong group, so I'm just going to go to Effects Controls, then go to Tools, Synchronize Layers, and it's going to move everything back to this layer. And let's just keep this active. The other thing I'll do is I'll get this mesher, and we'll call this mesher underscore activation shapes, just so we know what it's called. Now I'm going to hide the mesher, so just disable that, and also in here we can change this to dots, and that way we don't see it, we're just going to see the activation happen over time. Now another thing, we don't need all these particles right now. We might use them later on, but I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do a split amount and do a delete. And it's really important to put the split amount at the very top because it's going to read these sequentially down. So splitting about let's try 80%. It's still a lot of particles there, but you'll notice now this is a little bit faster. It's still kind of slow, a little bit faster as the spread happens. So I'm going to do a preview of this just so we can see this in real time and get an idea of what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to play this back in kind of slow motion just because this doesn't always play back so smoothly. I'll go at half speed, but just because I'm capturing video and trying to play it back at the same time. But as you can see in the very beginning, you can see the map is spreading over everything. It's working out pretty well. Okay, so that's basically what we've been doing. We've been setting up a procedural way to have the shader activate using a particle system so we can control the spread. We literally can control the shapes. We could even have physical objects spreading out over everything if we want to hand animate things moving on, whatever we want to do. Okay, so we've done a lot of heavy lifting here, and we're front loading the work now so that way it's a lot easier later on. Now, given the system, it's pretty basic. it is a little slow. I'm going to try and limit the particle count a little bit more if I can. I don't want to do it too much, but I think that should be okay. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to assign a shape to this. And I do exactly what I did before, but these won't be random. I'm going to make this 80 side spheres, and we can choose scale, affect the scale just a little bit, like randomize it a little bit. Event duration, absolute, and let's display this as geometry. And I just want to take a look and get an idea of like what this looks like. Okay, so right now they're huge. So let's try 10. Oops. So even 10 is too big. Let's try 1. I'm going to try 0.3 as my scale. Okay, so right now I'm basically just saying, I'm going to try 0.1. Wow. Actually, okay, so at this point 0.3 is fine. It's the variation. I'm going to set the variation to 0 for now, just while we get this locked down. So what I want to do is I'm going to hit the auto key, and I'm going to then set this to, what do I want it to be? Let's say 50. Let's try that. I'd say 50 is probably a good number. We can play with it later. I'm basically going to be doing exactly what I did before. I want these to scale up over time. So with this one, I'm going to change this to shader activated for the event. And let's just click the particle system. Again, graph editor, curves. I'm going to go down to placement shapes event, and we want shader activated. Scale. So just like before, let's just turn constraint proportions off. And I'm going to right click, copy, and then paste as an instance to these other two events, exactly like what we did before. Now, let's just select both of these, holding control, and then we can fit it. I can make it a linear curve. Let's right click on this, so it's 0.3 and then it's 50 over 120 frames. I'd say let's go 75. I think it's just more, 120 frames is a little too, not enough, but let's just try that. So just scrubbing through this really quick, you can see these spheres beginning to activate. And that's basically what it's starting to look like. So, it's not bad. Just so I can see this in real time, what I'm going to do next is, just looking through this really quickly, to see if there's anything I can do to make this a bit faster. Yeah, I think it's fine. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to cache this out to disk, and that's just going to speed things up drastically. So I just right-clicked, miscellaneous cache disk, click here. First thing is let's cache to viewport and render, really important, and we'll max out the memory limits so that way it doesn't ever stop if it hits a certain amount. Next, let's choose where we're going to cache this out to. It's going to call this PFS placement shapes V001. Okay, so with all of that set up, I'm now going to cache this out, and we'll take a look at the final result. Well, not final, but this just means it'll all be cached and we don't need everything turned on. Like I said, it is a little slow, so I'm just thinking of what I can do to kind of speed things up. I'd prefer to use these, but for now I'm just going to make it 20-sided spheres. And also with our shape noise, I might go back here and set that to only like 12 segments, just whatever I can do to speed things up a little bit. Okay, so it's probably good to save your work at this point, just, you know, in case this ends up being too slow and it becomes unresponsive, something like that. But I imagine it shouldn't be too bad. So I'm going to turn update viewports off and hit update all. Okay, and so one thing, sorry, I got too many windows open here. Let's play through what we got. So that's looking pretty good in general, just for activating. But I do feel like it doesn't need to get to that scale. That is kind of ridiculous. So I'm going to tone this back just a little bit. So with the particle system selected, my scale factor, and I just actually, just as I ran this, I scaled it down a little bit, but I feel like we can scale it down more. I'm going to try 110. Sorry, this is one thing about Max 2018 I don't like, is everything snaps very easily. So getting the scale factor, I'm going to just make it be a bit more linear in the scaling. Maybe ramp up a little bit, but then it's very gradual. It's going to end up at 110 and settle over that time. But, you know, I'll run this again in a moment, so this is still the current settings, I think. So, you know, I'll need to recache this out in a moment, but in general, you can see what's going on. We have this procedural activation, which is working out really well. And it's just a matter of, like, are these in the places that we want? And then that's the next tricky part about this. So I'm going to look at going back to our original system, and we're almost done with this. I know it's been a big lesson considering what we're doing, but I'm going to go back just to our original setup here. And we're just going to have this scaling on over time. I'll change the display to geometry just so we can see it. But yeah, this basically scales on like this over time. Now, with that, maybe we don't like the original placement. And that's just a matter of getting the split amount and changing the placement to where we want it. But we know that the end result is going to be activating in those areas. So, you know, usually we would do this very early on, but I want to show what it's actually doing before we kind of got too into it, because otherwise it's just going to look kind of silly looking at these shapes over and over. But I feel like that sort of placement is pretty good overall. But I'm going to run the caching for this one last time, and I think that will be in a pretty good spot at this point. Save your work, run the sim, and let's check out the result. Okay, so this seems to be working pretty well. Basically now we just have it so it scales up around 140. We can see the infection pretty visibly, and it just continues to spread over time. So the whole point of this is that initially we're going to get some bits happening, and then over time it continues to spread. Obviously, again, like I always want to look at this in context. If we go back to our original character render, we can hide the controls, and just playing through this, we can see that the infection's happening. At this stage, the face is starting to get covered up anyway, which is good. So we're just going to see underneath more and more of this infection. Obviously, it's not going to look like he has shampoo in his hair. It's, you know, all that's happening is underneath. This is the shader activating. So all of this is going to come into context in a moment really effectively. But for now, it just means that all of this area is being activated. Okay? So by that stage, by towards the end of the shot, you know, all the areas that we painted will all have been activated, but of course we'll have enough effects going on that, and on the hands as well, that we won't really see that too much. Okay. Alright, so that's looking really good. Okay, so here comes the fun part. Finally, with this particle system set up, we're going to use this to drive some of the shader stuff. So let's go back into our shader here, and I'm just going to call this emission shader, because this is going to be what emits the initial texture and everything. Okay, now with the color correction and that mask and everything, what I want to do is I want to right click and copy this texture, go in here, and we'll call this mask shader, and I'm going to just right click, paste copy, not instance, but paste copy in there, and then click it, and then choose a mask, choose to keep it, and finally swap. So just drag it onto the bottom slot, swap them around. Now what I want to do next is, we haven't set this up to be working with V-Ray. Technically we don't need V-Ray, but I'm just going to my render menu and switching this out to V-Ray. Okay, so that way I can take advantage of V-Ray as the renderer. So what I want to do at this point is, we have this mask set up, which is the texture and all that. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and clone, copy, and we'll call this face head mask, and then hide the unwrap model. Now the reason for that is because technically we're emitting from this mask, and again we're going to get that circular dependency if we mess with that too much. Plus, in addition, I want to, so I'm just going to expand this really quick. Character controls. Yeah, I want to get this head mask. I want to use this as a renderable object, at least for the next few steps. So with this being a separate object, I'm going to assign this new shader here, and then we'll click and do a V-Ray distance texture. Okay, and this can use an object to create a texture map based on the distance from these objects here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to Mesher. In the top viewport, okay, we have the PFS placement shapes and shader activated. So I'm going to go into Mesher, drag this down the viewport, right click on the move button and center it. You can also do that down here as well, but I'm just positioning it to the center. Click, pick object, and then it's going to type in PFS underscore, I think it was activation shapes, right? And then deselect use all events, click add. So PFS placement shapes, I got the wrong one. So PFS placement shapes, and then click and add the event shader activated. Okay, so when I do that, we now have this new object here, which is the particle system converting to an object. And now that it's an object, I can then plug that into my texture. So I just clicked add and picked it. And while we got it here, let's just call this PFS shader activation. And so now what's going to happen is I can use this object to control the distance between it and the shader itself. Okay, so let's just do a few things really quick. The far color is everything that is away from the shape. So I want that to be black, but I want everything near it to be white. But just for now, let's just make this purple, and then we'll click on the inside separate, and we'll make this more of a pink. Finally, let's go back up the top and set the self-illumination to 100%, and that way at least we can see what's going on here. And so it'll just be easier to differentiate between them all. Okay, so by rendering this out, we can see, you know, we got a lot of stuff going on here. We got all these shapes. For now, I'm just going to get the meshes and turn them off. And I'm also going to go into a particle system, right click, and go renderable. And that way the particle system won't be renderable. This guy here is off, but we might as well just right click and turn renderable as well. And that just means that nothing in there is going to actually show up. And I'm also going to change this to dots and dots. So again, I'm just, I don't have to worry about seeing a lot of stuff. So that being said, at least now the shapes aren't going to show up. So now we can see we're getting some interesting looks to this. So going back in here, right now we have that mask set up and it's monochromatic. We can actually display it. So that's the mask there, okay? And so I can actually make this much brighter if I wanted to. The whole point is that it's going to blend inside of that shape. And then we have the distance here, which is activating it. So right now, just for fun, I decided to change the colors, but you can kind of see purple and all these other things. So I'm going to set the distance to 3, which is a bit smaller. And initially, you'll see that there's not too much showing up. The mask is still visible though. I'll have to look into that in a moment. But as this spreads, it's going to reveal more and more to have color. Okay. So, quick couple of things. I'm just going to go into my render menu because I just changed it over really quick. So I'm going to turn GI off, and I'm going to change this to, keep it on progressive, but I'll set this to be relatively low. I just want quick renders to start out. Extremely quick. Okay, so with this, I'm just going to set this to be more of a gray texture and this to be a white texture. And this way the entire thing should be black and white. I'll turn off linear. Okay, so let's just go back to our color correction. I don't need to set these extreme colors. I just was doing that for the viewport's sake. But let's set them both to 0. Our shader should be fine as is. Worst case, we can always bump it up if we need to. But basically what we want is just to get a black and white shader going. And we'll go up to the top layer now, and we'll just set the diffuse to black. Okay, and that should give us a black and white map. Okay, so initially, we don't have that much visible just because there isn't that much revealing. And then as more reveals, we can see more and more is wiping on. Okay, so turning the mesher on for a second, this will become a lot more visible. With the mesher, I'm just like both of these, I'm going to just right click and make this visible by like 0.2 just for a second. Just so that way they should just come out transparent. Anyway, I'm not too fussed with this. I don't want these to actually be renderable, so we'll just turn that off. And I realize I'm going through this kind of quick here, but the whole point is that we now have this black and white mask which is wiping on over time. So it actually reveals over time, which is kind of cool. And we can take this a step further, and as this begins to blend on, we could actually go into our V-Ray distance. So we could set the near color, which is gray. We could go in there and set this to be like a cellular shape. And just click show in viewport. Let's set this to explicit maps. That's going to use the UVs. I'll set that to like 0.01, whatever it's going to look like in your viewport that matches this. So fractal 0.01. We'll click the middle color. We'll bump that up a little bit. But the whole point is now we're getting more of a broken up pattern. I'll try chips. In fact, I might do it the other way around because I want this to be very broken apart. Keep that around mid. I'll lower the spread instead. So the whole point is I'm just going to actually, I'm trying to bring the spread up to break the pattern up more. So what happens is this would be the mid color. So I'm going to just throw some more settings around. I could try roughness, but this might like break it up a bit too much. That's not too bad. Alright, so anyway, I'm just going back and forth with this, but the whole point is that we've got a pretty straightforward shader. Basically, we have a mask. The mask is the black and white hand-painted texture, and then we have the vary distance, which plugs into the particle system. So as the particles spread over everything, the distance there, which is set to 3, will cause these colors to activate. White for when it's inside of the shape, and then when it's near it, it's going to use that cellular shape, and the cellular shape is all broken up. So that way, rather than getting a perfect shape, we get that cellular edge, which works out really well. And yeah, like I said, I wouldn't mind just playing around with this a little bit, just trying to see what I can get from it, because I'd really like to use this to kind of break it up more. So I'm just going to play with these settings a little bit. It's been a while since I've actually had to do any cellular stuff, but I might do that, then get the color input. So it's just a little rollout at the bottom here, and then use that to crush the darks down more, and then bump up the brights to be a bit more solid. So by doing that, it should break this up a bit more. So this is basically what we're going for. You know, I just paused it for a second because obviously I'm going back and forth a little bit with the settings, but basically chips, fractal, small size, UVs, the middle gray color is 55, threw in some variation. I mean, none of this, you know, I don't worry about that, but the main thing is bring up my mid and the spread, which helps us kind of bring the brights down. And on top of that, if we want, we could drag that onto distance as well and make that an instance. So between the two, we're basically getting that breakup around the edges. Whereas if I fast forward a few frames, we'll get more and more activating till it reaches the edges. Okay, so it's just handy in the beginning before it reaches the edges of the map. So at the very beginning, instead of it being like this soft, perfect color, we get that breakup instead, which I think works pretty well. Okay, so yeah, if I were to turn these maps off, it would just look pretty flat as it kind of spreads out. So this just helps break it up a little bit more. Cool. And yeah, so at this point, we've built a pretty effective map that spreads out over time and creates that infection. And we can now use this to drive the displacement, the shaders, the fluids, the liquids, you know, so much other stuff.